Welcome to this massive open online course on Indian Economics 1. Today we shall concentrate on the module 1 of this particular course, which is the aspects or the features of Indian economy at the time of our independence. Now the learning outcomes of this particular module will be that after the finishing of this particular module, you will get an idea of the major features of Indian economy at the time of our independence. And secondly, you will develop an analytical power of locating the basic reasons behind such underdeveloped nature of Indian economy at the time of our independence. And thirdly, you will be interested to undertake studies in future regarding these issues. Now, the major features which we want to discuss here are the low level of income and per capita income of Indian economy at the time of our independence, number one. Number two, underdeveloped structure of Indian economy. Number three is poor condition of Indian agriculture. Number four is the shallow base of the industrial sector of Indian economy at that particular time. And the next one is the imbalance in the foreign trade in India at that time. And the last one we shall indicate is the inadequacy in the infrastructural, that is social and economic infrastructure of India at that time period. Let us first look into the low level of national and per capita income in India. Now, before independence, a long period, 200 years, India was ruled by the colonial power. And during that particular time period, India was under huge exploitation, colonial exploitation, starting from 1757, that is at the time of the Battle of Plassey, when East India Company won that battle and started exploiting India, and we call it exploitation under merchant capitalism. What is the meaning of the exploitation under merchant capitalism? It meant that the traders of East India Company, they used to purchase commodities from India at a very low price and used to sell them at a high price in the foreign countries. So that extraction of surplus was termed as the colonial exploitation under merchant capitalism. Then, from the beginning of the 19th century, with the emergence of industrial revolution in England, there came the colonial exploitation under industrial capitalism, which meant that England used to export the mill-made finished commodities to India, particularly cotton textile items, and used to purchase raw materials from India. And they put huge restrictions upon the export items of India and thereby exploiting the surplus from India, and that is known as colonial exploitation under industrial capitalism. Now, in the later half of 19th century, when the industrial power of several other European countries that was indicating an increasing trend, so England was losing its power. So to retain the power, the industrial power or the financial power of England, they instigated or induced the foreign investors of England to invest in the other sectors in India, and the financial capital inflowed to India in sectors like Indian railways, Indian tramways, Indian irrigation, so that the foreign investors can invest in India and they can take away the return, high return from India. So what we observe a huge drainage of resources from India and through colonial exploitation. And this huge drainage of resource means that resource could not be recycled or invested for the benefit of India. And that led to low capital formation. And low capital formation means a reduced investment. And reduced investment led to poor employment opportunities or low employment opportunities, and again leading to low income, and low income means low standard of living. Thereby, you can well understand the why at the time of Indian independence, the standard of living of average Indian people was so low. An estimation indicates that during 1948-49, the national income of India was only to the tune of 8,650 crore, and the per capita income of India in 1948-49 prices was only 247 rupees. That is about 20 rupees per month, which was very low compared to any standard acceptable, say, per capita income throughout the globe. And another estimation shows that the growth rate of per capita income during 1860 to 1945 was stagnant. It remained only 0.5% at that time period. So at the time of independence, the rate of growth of our economy measured in terms of the growth rate of per capita income was also at a very stagnant stage. So we call it a stagnant economy at the time of Indian independence. Another estimate shows that the cost of living index was also increasing during that time period. So together we can well understand the living status of average people in India at the time of our independence. Now coming to the structural dimension of Indian economy during that time period, if you look at the pie chart I have shown in this particular screen, you will observe that the sectoral contribution to GDP in terms of the contribution of the primary sector to GDP was about 54%. Primary sector constitutes agriculture and allied sector, mining, quarrying, etc. etc. So the maximum part of GDP came from the primary sector. That means our economy was agrarian economy. And occupational structure also shows that at that time period, at the time of our independence, in 1951-52 data, it shows that about 72% of the workforce of India depended on primary sector, that is agricultural sector. Now, development economics suggests that if in any country you observe this type of this structural status, then that country is considered as a relatively underdeveloped economy. So at the time of Indian independence, the condition was very much underdeveloped. Now, coming to the condition of Indian agriculture. One study, it shows that during that time period, particularly during 1921-1946, the rate of growth of average yield per hectare was negative. Normally, the productivity of agriculture is measured in terms of yield per hectare. It was negative. The growth rate was negative. And if you observe the per capita yield of some of the crops in India during that particular time period, for example, during 1949-50, the paddy, in case of paddy, the per hectare yield was only 110 kg, whereas in Japan, it was 748 kg. So compared to the international standard, the agricultural productivity was very low. And now we can show the basic reasons, the causes behind that poor condition of Indian agriculture. The first thing is poor irrigational facilities. In fact, during the British time, they gave more emphasis on railways rather than our irrigational system. And one estimate shows that during 1919 to 1947, out of the total expenditure by the British government, only 18.6% went to our irrigation and 58% went to railways. So more emphasis was on railways and lesser emphasis was on Indian irrigational system. And we observed that during 1941 to 1946, only 27% of the total cultivable area, they got the benefit of this government irrigational facilities. Okay? And even then, that facilities went to some particular sectors of India. Normally, the Punjab and some western part of UP only received that facility. Now come to the other reasons. Now, namely, I am pointing out the typical land revenue system in India. Zamindari system was adopted by Lord Cornwallis. That was the land revenue system where the Zamindars used to collect revenue from the poor tenants and used to give that revenue, a part of that revenue, to retain their zamindari power. Now, there was rack renting and there was massive eviction of, say, these poor farmers from their tenancy holding. That means there was no security of tenancy right. So the poor tenants, okay, the tenant farmers, then they knew very well that even if they put their effort for the productivity increase in their cultivable area, this fruits of that particular effort will be pocketed by the jamindars. So farmers were not interested to improve the productivity of the land. And the agricultural policy of British government was actually geared to the interest of the British government. So they encouraged commercial, farming. That means encouraging more on cash crops rather than food crops. So we find that more and more areas were covered by indigo, they're covered by raw cotton, the jute. In this way, the people, that means the common farmers, they depended too much on the local money lenders, because commercial farming, it needed huge amount of credit in terms of money. Therefore, there was the problem of indebtedness among the farmers. Now we shall concentrate our attention to the industrial sector during that particular time period, that is at the time of Indian independence. Now the condition of industrial sector of any economy can be judged by the share of industrial output to total output and the share of industrial employment to total employment in an economy. Now, if you look into these particular features during 1948-49, we'll find that only 2.8% of the Indian workforce, they were employed in the industrial sector, and only 7.1% of India's net national product was contributed by the industrial sector. So you can well understand the condition of Indian industrial sector. Now, what are the basic reasons for such shabby or unhealthy industrial sector at the time of our independence? The first reason is that the decay of Indian handicraft industry during 19th century. Indian handicraft industry or handloom industry was very rich, but it could not withstand the competitive, this particular areas where the foreign mill-made goods came to India, the cotton cloth, and our handicraft industry could not withstand that competition. So gradually, Indian handloom and handicraft industry was abolished. So it could not generate enough employment. So massive pressure was upon Indian agriculture. Therefore, we find that vacuum which was created by the abolition of handicraft industry could not be, fulfilled or supported or supplemented by the expansion of medium and large-scale industries. We'll not find. Even some industries were developed, major, medium, and large-scale. Still, the policy of the British government was imperial preference. What is imperial preference? For example, they put import tariff on for protecting Indian industry, for example, the textile industry. But it was observed that for non-British goods, the tariff rate was higher. But for British goods, the tariff rate was lower. That means actually the objective was not to protect Indian industry. So under this type of policy of the British government, Indian industries, medium and large scale, could not develop. Secondly, the public sector, large-scale public sector industries were also absent. For example, only in case of Tisco, we will find that under Jamsetji Charter, we will find that such large-scale industrial unit in case of iron and steel, but we will not observe any such industrial unit under public sector. So these were some of the reasons for the shallow industrial base at the time of Indian independence. Now coming to our foreign trade. Now India was a net exporter of cotton goods, but during the British rule, India became a net importer of cotton textiles, and India became a net exporter of the raw material, that means the low value items or raw cotton. Now, if we look into some of the reports at the time of Indian independence, we'll find that the composition of our trade was concentrated only in few goods, namely agriculture and allied articles or allied products. And our exports were mainly concentrated only in few commodities, namely tea, coffee, cotton manufactures, edible oil, raw hides, and skins, etc. That means there was no enough diversification in our export, and intensity of our export was very low. And we typically observe that during 1948-1949, Government of India also followed some liberal import policy so as to give some facility for some of the difficulties that was faced even after independence regarding the import of food crops and other raw materials. So for some time that import policy was liberalized. And there was an inflationary pressure. So these gave a positive, this opportunity for the foreign investors to invest or to export their products to India so that they get high price from India. So our import payment was rising, but our export value was not to the tune of our import payment. That means our import payment was higher than our export income. So what happened? We find that during 1940-45, there was a positive balance in our external trade. That means balance of trade indicated a positive balance to the tune of about 323 crore. But after independence, during 1949-50, our data indicates that the balance of trade was deficit. That means our import payment was greater than our export income to the tune of about 132 crore. Now, coming to the infrastructural facilities that we received at the time of Indian independence. It is very important because if you do not have proper infrastructural facilities, then you cannot expand in terms of your output, your industries cannot expand. Now, this infrastructure can be divided into two parts. One is called economic infrastructure, which constitutes transport and communication, generation and distribution of electricity, etc. Now, so far as the power generation is concerned, our statistical data indicates that at the time of Indian independence, the power generation was only to the tune of 1,362 megawatt in 1947. And per capita consumption of electricity was only about 16.3 kilowatt in 1947, which was very, very low. So far as railways are concerned, we find that for the interest of the British people or the British government, they expanded railways. And there was satisfactory expansion of Indian railways. And we find the route miles per 1,000 square mile was extended from 0.5 mile to 226 miles during a particular period, just before independence. And so far as roadways is concerned, in 1951, we find that out of the total road length in India during that time period, about 3.99 lakh kilometer. Out of that, only 2% constituted the national highways, and 52% of the total roadways constituted in rural roadways. That means they were not all-weather road, and most of the road were not connected with the main highway. Therefore, due to this paucity of economic infrastructure, our industries could not expand during that time period. Now, coming to the inadequacy in terms of the social infrastructure at the time point, at that particular time point. That means, so far as the health is concerned, in 1950-51 statistical data, it indicates that the number of registered medical practitioners per 10,000 Indian population was only 1.7, so low. And the number of hospital beds per 10,000 population was only 3.2. Now, the primary health centers, which are normally concentrated in rural areas, there were only 725 primary health centers. So with such poor health infrastructure in our country, we find that the death rate was very high. It was about 27.4 per thousand population in 1950-51, and the life expectancy at birth was only 33 years. Now it is very high. Therefore, we find that the health infrastructure was very poor because of these reasons, and the development of an economy depends not only on the growth in income, the development in the true sense of the term depends on health, education, nutrition, etc. Now, coming to education, what we find that in 1947, only one primary school was observed on an average in an area of 5 square miles. That means number of primary schools were inadequate. And in addition, there is acute shortage of infrastructure in the schools and colleges. For example, shortage of bench, shortage of this blackboards, shortage of teachers, etc. These are the shortages. And if you find this shortage, then you cannot provide proper service, educational service for the benefit of the common. Therefore, what was the result? The result was the average literacy rate in India was very low. It was only about 18.3%. And even it was lowest in case of female population of India. It was only about 8.9% in 1950-51. Therefore, what we observe, very poor infrastructural facility. Now, what is more important is that there is an inherent inequality in the distribution of infrastructural facility during that time period. What is that inequality in the distribution? That means the infrastructural facility was concentrated only in few states, in few areas. And we find that electricity generation was initially located to the areas where we had, say, industrial units, very concentrated in some particular areas. In addition, irrigational facilities were also concentrated in some parts of India, as we have already stated, in Punjab, in western part of UP. So there was inequality in the distribution of infrastructural facility. And roadways also remained underdeveloped. So what we observe that, in conclusion, we can tell you that if you discuss these basic features of Indian economy at the time of our independence, we find that Indian economy was trapped in a low-level equilibrium trap. In the words of Nelson, great economist Nelson, he suggested that an economy will be trapped in a low-level equilibrium trap if this per capita income remains at a very low level and there is huge population pressure and we are in a poverty trap. So that was there. And the economy was considered as an underdeveloped economy. Why? Because low level per capita income, low savings, low investment, poor agriculture, and the technology was primitive, and the industrial base was also at a very low stage. And what is more important was that infrastructural facilities was also not very much developed. So from this particular module, we can see that if you want to start the discussion of Indian economy from 1950s or early 1950s, then you can suggest that what type of challenges that India faced. This is only because of the type of economy, that underdeveloped type of economy. So the challenge was to shift Indian economy from underdeveloped to developing and developed, which we are actually heading towards at present. Thank you so much for attending this online MOOC course.